Okay, guys, welcome to part 4 of our discussion about the big ideas and key concepts of special education and working with exceptional learners. So this first part is just going to be a quick question just to activate your background knowledge, okay? So your prior information on this topic, just to get you thinking. And this will be a pretty short video. We'll start a little abstract, do some critical thinking, talk about some contentious points in special education. Then we'll get a little more solid and then, again, kind of leave you with some of those known unknowns that we have in special education. So I'm going to read this question to you. You can pause the video, just think about it, and then resume when you're ready. So in what ways have the attitudes and values of a society or even a time in history determined how people with disabilities are viewed and treated? Pause the video, think about that, press play when you're ready to move forward. Okay, so hopefully you've had a little time to think about how society and history has treated people with disabilities. They haven't been kind in a lot of points in history. Let's talk about eugenics for a second. Now, this is a dark idea, a very dated idea, but something that was really present in years past. And it was this idea of this niche, very small group of scientists, and this kind of actually infiltrated the Nazi thinking for a while, that we could basically control who reproduced with who, in other words, to create the perfect human being. Okay, so controlling who could have children and who could not have children based on cognitive fitness, based on physical fitness. So the whole idea is that we weren't being scientific or rigorous enough in who we were allowing to have children, and that was resulting in people who were unfit for society because they had physical limitations or cognitive or emotional difficulties in some way. So it was this idea, if we can control who's having children and control what children are allowed to live, we'll kind of have the perfect society, just perfect specimens of human. I know, it sounds insane, and you can kind of pause and read through this. This is a real article in Popular Science Monthly, and they basically talk about, we just allow whoever to have babies. Well, it's no wonder that we have so many mentally and physically unfit people in the world. Obviously, thinking like this had an impact on the way people perceived those folks with disabilities at the time. That's a very, very dark point in history, is this whole eugenics movement. Moving to something a little more contemporary, and this is not an easy topic, and I want to just kind of first put to bed some misinformation around this topic. So you may have heard of this, and then we'll just kind of present this as, wow, this is a really complicated scenario that there's a lot of emotions tied up in. And so this idea of prenatal screenings that have become pretty commonplace, especially in Europe. In the U.S., they're utilized more and more. But you may have heard that basically children with Down syndrome are disappearing in Iceland. And this is true. The misinformation often is that they're putting kids who are born with Down syndrome to death. I've actually heard that spinning around. That's not true. What it is women who go to the doctor who are pregnant, they are all offered a prenatal screening that can detect Down syndrome, which is basically there's an extra chromosome 21, and so that they make that detection, and then they can say your kid is going to have Down syndrome. Well, it's optional. You don't have to do the prenatal screening, but 80 to 85% of people in Iceland, women in Iceland, elect to have the screening. Of those who elect to have the screening, if they determine that their child is going to have Down syndrome, almost 100% of those women choose to abort. And so therefore that's led to this massive decline in the number of kids with Down syndrome in Iceland. And so, this is a huge debate. Obviously there's the whole pro-life, pro-choice approach to it. That's kind of where you fall in that is where you fall in that. It is hard for me to pass judgment on, a parent who, they're trying to foresee the hardships for themselves, for this kid. But at the same time, we've talked about every kid is different. Maybe they think about the hardships that this kid's going to have, but their child with Down syndrome could be the next Jamie Brewer, who we talked about earlier, the actress who's very successful, yet she had Down syndrome. So this is a slippery slope. I'm not one to judge anyone. There is this kind of this hint of eugenics that is kind of flowing into this, that, this is a complicated one. So think about that one, but this is a hotly debated topic, and it's definitely a time in history that's having an impact on people with disabilities. So let's talk about this real quick, and this is this idea of using the R word, and how we really should not be doing that. So in years past, we called people who had significantly below average IQs mentally retarded. And that is actually the term that's still used in the legislation, people with mental retardation, which is a disability category. But that's an old term that we really don't use these days, because it really has become a pejorative term that minimizes people's humanity. When people say retarded, often they're using it as a cut down. And when you do that, when you say that someone is retarded, you're basically comparing them to someone who has a disability and saying you are less than. So there's all kinds of negative connotations associated with this word now. So there was actually a law passed called Rose's Law, which mandates that practitioners and people who work with people with disabilities should be using the term intellectually disabled as opposed to mental retardation. And I know people might see that and go, oh, political correctness. Really, this ties back to, yes, there's an ethical component. Retarded has become derogatory because, again, you're talking about a group of people and saying they are less than. I'm using this term as a pejorative. But it really is an old phrase that is not accurate anymore. So when we're talking about mental, we're actually talking about things like emotions, emotional states. Well, that's not what we're talking about with someone with an intellectual disability. An intellectual disability, they have significant sub-average IQ. So that's cognition. That's not emotions. And emotions are attached to mental states, mental descriptions. So really it is more accurate to say that someone is intellectually disabled because we're talking about the actual area in which these people have limited functioning. Okay, and so mentally retarded is an old phrase, and there are some even older phrases that at the time were just considered commonplace and scientific, but have become pejorative. That seems to be the case with any term we attach to the population. And so, imbecile, idiot, moron, those were things that doctors in years past used to describe people with intellectual disabilities. Here's a picture of a historical home. This is the main school for the feeble-minded. How would you like it if that was the name of your school? So you can tell that there is importance in words and the words that we use when talking about people with disabilities. And you can kind of see that here. So this is a more recent publication in an academic journal. It's about research working with kids with disabilities. This is all about using videos on an iPad to teach math skills to high school students who had autism and intellectual disability. So you can see the way that's phrased. Compare that to a journal that I found. It's an article I found from the 70s. Shock as punishment in a picture naming task with retarded children. And so these kids were called retarded. There's no person first language there. But just the approach to working with people with disabilities at that time. Up here, we're talking about using video, using technology to teach meaningful skills. Here we're talking about getting kids to accurately name pictures, and if they make a mistake, they get shocked. Contingent electric shock. That's insane to me. But that was the way people with disabilities were treated for a very, very long time. Hence the need for safeguards and the things that are outlined in IDEA, that important federal law. Okay, and we'll end with this. So there's this idea of full inclusion, which basically means there are some people who think that people with disabilities, regardless of severity of the disability, of type of the disability, they should be included with their gen ed peers in schools all the time, no questions asked, and we need to figure out how to make it work. That's a controversial notion, as you can imagine. There are some ethical considerations. Yes, do we have the right to separate people because they are born with a disability? The argument for full inclusion is no, we do not. And as a society, we have an obligation to figure out a way to allow these people to participate with their peers. But then there's some people who talk about skill development and things we have to consider, because it becomes more complicated when you talk about teaching skills to people with disabilities. often people with more severe or profound, even moderate disabilities, like intellectual disabilities, for example, autism, they need to be taught life skills, okay, how to be independent when they leave school. There may not be a place for that necessarily in a general education classroom because they're learning academic content. And so there may be this disconnect in the type of information that can be taught. So here's a pretty controversial paper that came out a few years back. Basically, and you can see through the title there, the title is, "I can identify Saturn, but I can't brush my teeth." What happens when the curricular focus for students with severe disabilities shifts? And so these folks, some of them from the University of Georgia and Gwinnett County, really pushed back on this idea of kids with severe disabilities need to be learning the same academic content as everyone else. It's like, okay, they can identify planets in the solar system, but can these kids take care of themselves? Can they tie their shoes? Can they brush their teeth? Maybe not, because we've spent all the time working on academics as opposed to teaching them functional, independent life skills. I get that, but I also get the flip side, the argument that it is a slippery slope when you start predetermining people's potential. How do you know when a kid will not benefit from academics and needs functional life skills? That may seem like that's an easy call to make. It truly is not. And when you start predetermining what a person is capable of, that's scary to me. And so there's a lot to unpack with this situation. This is a very complicated notion and one that we cannot agree on in the field of special education. It is a known unknown what the best answer is.